Okay, so to begin our applique process and our embroidery process on this table runner, we're going to start with the little ornament that is probably the easiest one to do. When I did mine, I put a layer of mylar. And the mylar, because I was adding this fill, and it's not a solid fill, I didn't want the mylar to pick out, so I used a layer of mylar and a layer of tulle over top of it, just to give it a shade of red, but not the deep red. Again, you can use any applique fabric. I just happen to have two layers here, one red mylar and one with the tulle over top of it. So what we're going to do here, the purpose of this is to see how you can stack your outline stitches and get a different look with it. So we're going to go ahead and create this. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go into our IQ Designer, and we are going to use the built-in shapes, and we're going to start with the circle. So we're going to grab the circle, and when the circle comes in, and I'm doing these in a little bit of a different order than the way it will be on your PowerPoint, because not all of the machines can you assign the line property as you're bringing it in. So I'm going to create my design on all of these and then assign the properties after I've created everything on the screen. So when this comes in, you'll notice that everything comes in with the red box around it. When the red box is around it, we've got the size and rotate icons that we can use. If I touch off of this and I no longer have the red box, these buttons go to sleep. So I either can hit the undo button to bring the red box back, or I can use my select key. So if there's no red box, I can use the select key and draw a box around it. And again, with the red box around it, I can do things like size and rotate. If you're on the Destiny, the Ariel, or the Meridian, your select key is right here. Okay, so when the red box is around it, we want to size this. So when I touch the size, the default is about 6.5 inches. We're going to use the down size. We want to make it a 3-inch circle. So we're going to use the ones that shrink proportionately, and we are going to shrink it to about a 3x3 circle. I'm just going to keep shrinking, and when I'm done, I'm going to touch OK. And the first thing I want to do is I always want to save my shape after I've created it in memory. So I'm going to touch my memory, and you're either going to save it in your machine's memory or your USB stick. Again, if you are on one of the other machines, you're going to have a red arrow that's going into the pocket, and that's where you're going to save it. So the first thing we're going to do is create an applique. And so when we do an applique, we have three parts. We have the running stitch, which is the placement stitch. Then you put your fabric down and you tack it down. And after you tack it down, you cut away the fabric. And then we usually have some kind of a finishing stitch, which is normally a satin stitch, but we're going to do this in two parts. We're going to have a satin stitch with a little candle wicking stitch over top of it. So I'm going to go ahead. I want to make this a running stitch for my placement stitch. So I'm going to go to my line properties, and I'm going to touch my running stitch. And I want to touch a color. Let's touch red. Touch a color that you can see. Red's always a good color. My pencil's highlighted. So if I go over and touch my line, I'm going to tell it just to make one pencil point a running stitch. I want the entire circle to be a running stitch, so I'm going to touch my paint can or my beaker to pour the color on. So I'm going to touch this line and I'm pouring on red. So the whole line is red. Now I'm going to assign my properties. So I'm going to touch next, and what comes up is the running stitch. If you have a satin stitch that comes up, it either means you've got some random dot out here that you need to erase, or you didn't choose the running stitch to begin with. And this is a small stitch, but this is a small ornament, so I'm okay with this size. So I'm going to do what I call taking this to embroidery. So when I touch the word set, it tells us that we're leaving IQ Designer. It's okay, we've saved this shape. If you're not sure, go back and touch it again. Hit return, hit memory, and save it again. It's better to save more than not save. But when I do this, and I get this message, I'm leaving IQ Designer, and if I haven't saved it, I'm going to lose that shape. And I'm going to touch the word OK. And this is what I call taking it to embroidery, till you see the word embroidery. If you're on a Meridian, a Destiny, or a Ariel, you're going to have to touch down here 4 times until you see the word embroidery. So this is our running stitch or a placement stitch. Now I could go back to IQ Designer and I could go ahead and bring this up again and create another whole circle to do our tack down stitch. But an easier way to do the applique is to go to Edit, and if I touch my copy button, it copies it, it offsets it, touch move, and touch the center key, and now I have two circles, one right on top of each other. So if I close Edit, you see I've got two circles. One's on top of each other. So that's my running stitch, put my fabric down, tack it down, and then trim it away. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is my finishing stitch. But when I do my finishing stitch, if you remember the sample, I have the hanger in the middle here. So I don't want to run a satin stitch underneath this, because if I do, what happens is that satin stitch is going to kind of raise this up. So when I do the finishing stitch, I only want to do this much of it. So bear that in mind as we go back to IQ Designer. So I'm going to go back and touch the word Add. Okay. I'm going to go back to IQ Designer, and I am going to pull that from memory. So on a Solaris, I pull from memory up here. On the other machines, I'm going to use the blue arrow that's coming out of the pocket down here. So I'm going to go to my memory. I'm going to pull that circle and touch OK. All right. And let's go ahead and fill this first. So I'm going to go to my fill properties, and all of my cool fills are in here. I'm going to touch the word select. And again, some machines have 10 fills, some have 15, and if you're on a Solaris 2, you've got some 42 fills here. So let's go down. You can choose any one of these, but I'm going to choose this one. I'm going to touch it, touch OK. I've got a color selected. I'm going to touch OK. And again, this is a paintbrush. So what happens is I want to pour this color into here. But with the paintbrush highlighted, what I would do is be painting on that fill. I don't want to paint it on, I want to pour it in. So I'm going to hit undo 3 times to take that off. I want to touch my paint can, and I want to pour my fill in. So there's my fill, and I'm going to just do this as a separate step because I need to have a solid shape to fill, and so if I cut away the top, I won't have a solid shape. So I'm going to touch next. And when the blue thing is spinning, it means it's thinking. So my fill, I can go anywhere from 100% down to 50% up to 200%. So I'm going to make this 50%. So I press and hold, and it's going to stop at 50. And on a Solaris, it shows me immediately. It's thinking. So now it's about this small. This is the angle that it comes in at. This is my border. And I'm turning the border off because remember, I'm going to have my own border, a satin stitch. This is an offset key, and this is on the Solaris. So I can offset, or I'm sorry, a random shift. Let's go to a random shift. The maximum is 6, and watch what it does to this little fill here. It just kind of skews it. If you like it, fine. If you don't, we can go back. And I can go back to where it was, or I can do like, let's see what 2 looks like. And again, if you don't have a Solaris, you don't have this button where you can do random shifts. That's kind of cute, so I'll leave it there. And then this one is your offset, and we're going to go over this one in one of the next ornaments that we do. But if you have like a flower, it puts the flower right in the center as your fill. So let me show you on here. I'm going to go choose a flower fill. So let's choose this one and touch OK. You're going to see that it centers that flower. See how it puts the center right in the flower right in the middle? So this would be a pretty one too. Let's leave it there. I could make it smaller, but I'm going to leave it at 100%. But what random shift does, so if I do the random shift, it moves it left or right. So I'm just going to do a little bit and show you. So you're going to see instead of the flower being right in the center, it skews it, so it moves it over. and I can move it way off, but I'm going to put this back to no random shift because I like things nice and symmetrical. But that's what random shift does. This one is your thickness, and this is new to the Solaris too. So this is going to come in with multiple passes of thread, and this is going to be a lighter pass. So I'm going to make it lighter. Okay, and that should be the only thing that I'm digitizing. Okay, this has the outer edge. I don't want to sew this because I've already sewn it, so I'm going to go to no sew, and I'm going to tell it not to sew this outer line because I've already got my placement stitch, etc. So now when I touch next, the only thing I have here is my fill, and I know that because if I select my select keys, there's only one thing that I can digitize. And now I'm going to take this to embroidery. And you can see that that fill lined up right on top of, this would be my placement stitch, put my fabric down, tack it down, trim it away, and then it does my fill. So now I need to create my outline part. So I'm going to go to Add, I'm going to go back to IQ Designer, I'm going to go back to Memory, pull it out of your pocket, and I'm going to pull my little 3-inch circle that I created. And now what I want to do is I want to create a little topper on here, an ornament hanger. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to zoom in. So let's zoom in to about 400. That's pretty big. I'm going to zoom into 200. And then I want to put a grid on here. So I'm going to go to my settings page, and on your grid, I want to make a 1-inch grid. And that's just going to help me center my topper. So now when I go to add my topper, I'm going to go to my fill or my shapes, and I'm going to go to my pennant, and I'm going to grab this shape, which will make a really cute topper. And you can see it comes in so big you can't even see it. But while I'm zoomed in, I'm going to go ahead and size that, and I want to size that to 0.58 by 0.75. So I'm going to touch my size button, and if I use my proportionate sizer, I'm going to bring it down to 0.58. Oops, went too far. So I'm looking at the top number, 0.58 by 0.75. Okay, so this is going to be my topper, but I want it to fit inside of here. Okay, so let me move my topper out of the way for just a minute. I'm going to move it down here way off of my ornament. I'm going to go in and I'm going to choose my eraser. I'm going to make my eraser a square, and I'm going to make it 100%. So I'm going to take my square eraser and just cut a segment out of that circle. So I'm pressing and holding until it gets to 100%. And remember, when you're zoomed in, I want a square eraser. I'm going to touch OK. I'm going to put it right here in the middle so you can see. When I'm zoomed in, do you see how big this eraser is? So I'm just going to kind of line it up on that line, kind of equidistance. Do you see how I just got my eraser lined up in the center? And I'm just going to take it up and erase. Okay, so now I've got a broken circle here. And now I want to move this up. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this select key, put a box around this. Now I can move this shape and try to move it up, but one of the things that I like to do is just go to size or rotate, use the center key to put it in this. Well, I can't use that one now because I've already moved it, but I'm going to use these arrows to move it up. And I'm going to put it in the center kind of like this. And we're going to make this bigger here in just a minute, okay? But when I zoom down to 100%, this is pretty close, but I'm actually going to make this bigger in a minute. So let's size it. I'm going to make it a little larger. I don't want it touching, but I want a little bit of a opening in here. Okay, so I can make it just a tad bigger. You don't want it touching. Okay, so it looks pretty good. Now, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of my grid right now so that you can just see what lines I'm digitizing. So I'm going back to my properties and getting rid of my grid. Okay. Now what I want to do is I want to make this be a satin stitch. So I'm going to go to my line properties and I'm going to choose my satin stitch and a color. So I'm going to choose red, touch OK. And then I'm going to pour on the satin stitch. So I'm going to touch this, and I'm going to touch this, and that is going to give me a satin stitch here. Okay. At the same time, I'm going to create this guy. So I want to have a solid fill here. I'm going to go to my fill properties. I'm going to choose gray, and the solid fill is already selected. Again, I don't want to paint my color on, okay, to get rid of those. I want to pour my color on. So I'm going to touch this to pour my color on. And then I want this to be a bean stitch. So I'm going to touch line properties, bean stitch, gray, and again, I want this to be the gray color. So now I'm going to digitize this much of it. So I'm going to touch, and let's hit memory again, save it. Okay, and remember the last time, this one when we saved it, we've got this fill here. When I go to digitize it, the first thing that comes up is my solid fill. And my solid fill, I want to change the angle to 60 degrees. 60 degrees is just a good angle to use. I want to change my density to 110%. I want it as thick as I can get it. I'm going to leave the push-pull compensation at default. And this is my undersewing. I'm going to turn my undersewing on. Okay? And the undersewing is that random, when you're doing a solid fill, you'll see that it does like a grid. It goes back and forth, and then it starts doing the solid fill. That's undersewing. So we want to leave the undersewing on. So now we've digitized the fill. If I use the select key, the next thing is my bean stitch, and I'm okay with a 0.08. And then the last thing is my satin stitch. And for satin stitch, you can play with satin stitch. You can use the default if you'd like. You can make it wider, you can make it less, it's totally up to you. But I'm going to make this wider just because we're going to add another fill. So I'm going to use a 0.14 just because it happens to be a pretty wide fill and I can add something on top of it. So I'm going to touch OK, and you're going to see that it's going to make that a pretty wide satin stitch. And I'm going to increase my density to 110% because I want it to be nice and solid. Okay, and now if I go select again, it's going to bring up our fill, which we've already digitized. So now I'm going to take this to embroidery. So I'm going to touch set, OK, and you can see that this is lined up right on top of where it should be, and my ornament filler looks as nice as well. So now the only thing I need to do is I want to add one more stitch on top of here, and I need to add a hanger. So I'm going to touch add. I'm going to go back to IQ Designer. I'm going to go back to from memory. So either here, if you're on a Solaris, or down at the bottom with the arrow coming out. I'm going to pull out that shape, which is the last one I put in with the fill. Touch OK. Okay. And the first thing now that I want to do is I want to add a hanger. So I'm going to go to my shapes. I'm going to go to, I believe it's this one. I'm going to touch this, touch OK. I'm going to size that. It comes in with the red box around it. I'm going to size it to 0.44 on top, and it should give me a 1.18 on the bottom, or close enough. Okay, so we're going to use this. We're going to rotate it 90 degrees. And I'm going to use my arrows to move it up. Okay, and I'm going to zoom in this time because I want to get it close. And I don't know if you can see the shape here, but I got to bring this down a little farther. And I don't want it touching. I want it to be close, but not touching. Okay, so now I don't want to do anything with this, the hanger, because I've already stitched that whole thing out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to digitize this. I want to assign a bean stitch, so I'm going to go Line Properties, Bean Stitch, Gray, touch OK, touch my box, my paint can, and touch this. Okay, I want that to be gray. I don't want it to sew this middle part. You can see it's not touching, so I'm going to go to No Sew. Paint can's highlighted. I'm going to say don't sew this line. So that one's a no sew. When it clicks, it's a no sew. I don't want to sew this. I've already done it. So I'm going to go to my Line Properties and touch no sew. Touch my paint can and say don't sew this. So the only other thing I have left to do is I'm going to put a candle wicking stitch on top of this. So I'm going to go to my Line Properties, touch my candle wicking stitch, choose a different color, touch my paint can, and touch this. So now that's going to be a candle wicking stitch. When I go to next, the first thing that I'm going to digitize is my little hanger. And 0.08 is a really small stitch, but that's okay. It's a really small hanger. The next thing that I'm going to digitize is my candle wicking stitch. And I want to make my candle wicking stitch just a little bit smaller. So I'm going to make, let's see, I'm going to make my candle wicking stitch a 0.12. So it fits on top of the other one. So let's go 0.12. That's the smallest it will go. And I'm going to make it a little farther apart. I'm going to make my spacing 0.6. And on a Solaris, as soon as I touch this, you can see it changing on here. Okay, and if I touch select again, it brings me back to this. So we only had two things to digitize. I'm going to take this to embroidery, and you can see that it puts the candle wicking stitch right on top of this. Okay, so I'm going to touch embroidery, and I'm going to go to my layout, and I want to move this, because in layout it's all joined. Remember, here everything's separate. When I touch embroidery, everything's combined. So I'm going to go to my move, and I want to put this in the center. So now it's centered. Okay, when I hit return, remember I can add my quilting right in here. I happen to know that this block is going to be cut to a 5x7, and I happen to know that we have a 5x7 hoop. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my combination, because remember, in this field, they're combined. In this field, it's not. So I'm going to combine everything. There it is combined. I'm going to go back to edit, and I'm going to touch my stippling. So if you're on a Solaris, you can only stipple, but if you're on if you're on a Destiny, you can only stipple. But on the Solaris, I've got all these other choices. But the first thing I want to do, I know it's going to be a 5x7 finished, well, not finished, it's going to be the cut size. So instead of making this huge and having to cut it down, I'm just going to go ahead and choose my 5x7 hoop. So I have to go down one size at a time. So there's the 9.5 by 9.5. Here's my 8x12 hoop. Then I'll have an 8x8 hoop. And there's the 7x14, the new one for the Solaris. There's the 6x10. These are optional hoops. 6x6 is an optional hoop. And the next one should be 5x7. So here's the 5x7 hoop. So here's what I'm talking about is if I make it 5x7, it's going to be this size. But if I used one of the larger hoops and cut it down to 5 by 7, I'd be chopping through all of those threads. So when I can select a hoop size or a box size, that way I'm not cutting into this and I don't have to worry about not having a tie off on any of these. So this block's going to get cut to 5 by 7. When I cut it, I just want to remeasure, but I'm going to use the 5 by 7. And again, if you're on the Destiny or the Meridian, you can only choose the stippling. If you're on a Solaris, you also have the option to go ahead and choose the Echo quilting, or you can choose any one of these. I'm going to just go ahead and use the Echo quilting. Distance just changes the distance from the edge. So you'll see in a minute it pulls this out farther from here. So instead of it being closer to the edge, now it's 0.2 away. I like it, the distance right up next to it, so I'm going to put that back to 0. And then the spacing is how wide your stippling is apart. So here's the default. If I press and hold this, I want to show you what the spacing does. I'm just going to pick a random number and you'll see how the Echo quilting goes much farther apart. Okay, I don't like that. So, but anyways, that's what spacing does, and if you were on a larger block, you might want to. And I know I'm in default when I get to that black box at the middle. Okay, let me let it catch up for a minute. Okay, so 0.2 is the default. You see how it has the black box around it? So I'm going to leave it at default. Okay, so there it is, and I'm going to touch OK, and I'm going to take it to embroidery, and I'm going to save it in my memory so that I can stitch it out. So anyways, everything, again, save, save, save. Okay, so here are your quilted blocks, and it's supposed to be like a table runner, so we've got them going in every direction, okay? And in the class, I gave you the cut features. If you were in the first class that I did, there is an error on the paper. This block here, the paper showed it was to be cut to 7 3/4 by 11.5. I'm sorry, 12.5, but it's supposed to be 11.5 wide. So this one's going to be 11.5, and this one is going to be 11.5. And I'll try to get those corrected measurements sent out to you guys. But anyways, after you sew everything together, you're going to follow the prompts on my sheet to sew things together, and then when you're all finished, we will show you how to quilt the filler blocks.